In 149 BC, Rome sent a massive army to North Africa to deal with Carthage for the final time. Carthage had already accepted Roman authority and handed over hostages to prove it wanted peace. Then Rome demanded something extraordinary. Every weapon inside the city had to be surrendered. Shields, swords, and even siege engines. More than 200,000 sets of armor and thousands of war machines were handed over to the Roman army. Rome believed Carthage was now harmless, but behind the city walls, something very different was beginning. This is the story of how Carthage secretly rebuilt its entire military while surrounded by the most powerful army in the ancient world. The Second Punic War, a conflict that shook the Mediterranean to its core, had ended in 201 BCE. It was a war dominated by the genius of one man, Hannibal Barca. He'd crossed the Alps with elephants, handed Rome some of its most catastrophic defeats, and brought the Republic to its knees. But Rome, through sheer, stubborn resilience, had endured. Led by Scipio Africanus, they took the fight to Africa, forcing Hannibal to come home. At the Battle of Zama, Carthage's fate was sealed. The peace treaty that followed was brutal. It was designed not just to end the war, but to permanently cripple Carthage. The city was stripped of all its overseas territories. Its mighty navy was reduced to a mere 10 vessels. A crushing indemnity of 10,000 silver talents was to be paid over 50 years. But the most insidious clause, the one that became a slow-burning fuse, was the ban on waging war without Rome's explicit permission. This effectively made Carthage a puppet state, its sovereignty an illusion. This political beatdown was made painfully real by Rome's ally, King Massinissa of Numidia. Parked right on Carthage's border, Massinissa, with a nod and a wink from Rome, began to systematically chip away at Carthaginian territory. He launched brazen raids, seizing land and resources, knowing full well that Carthage was forbidden to fight back. For decades, Carthage ate this humiliation. They sent envoys to Rome to plead their case, but the appeals fell on deaf ears. The Roman Senate, it seemed, was content to watch its old rival get slowly picked apart by a proxy. Despite these immense pressures, Carthage didn't just wither away. In a testament to its commercial genius and resilient people, the city started to recover. By the 150th BCE, its economy was humming again. Trade flourished, wealth returned, and the city, though militarily neutered, was regaining its economic might. This recovery, however, didn't inspire respect in Rome. It inspired fear. Within the Roman Senate, a powerful faction had long wanted Carthage's complete and utter destruction. Their most relentless champion was a senator named Marcus Porcius Cato, better known as Cato the Elder. After a visit to Carthage on a diplomatic mission, Cato was shocked by the city's booming prosperity. He didn't see a defeated foe, he saw a future threat. From that moment on, he became obsessed. Every speech he gave in the Senate, no matter the topic, ended with the same chilling refrain: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. This phrase became more than a political slogan, it was a drumbeat for war. Against this rising tide of hatred, more moderate voices, who argued a weak Carthage was a useful check on Numidia's power, were drowned out. Cato's fear-mongering and the ambition of other senators created a political climate where the destruction of Carthage felt inevitable. The breaking point came in 151 BCE. After decades of provocation, Carthage finally paid off the last installment of its war indemnity to Rome. Perhaps feeling a renewed sense of pride, and pushed to the absolute limit by Massinissa's aggressions, they made a fateful decision. They raised an army, and in direct violation of the treaty, attacked the Numidians. The campaign was a disaster. The Carthaginian army was defeated and surrendered, and many of its soldiers were massacred. For the war hawks in Rome, this was the excuse they'd been waiting for. Carthage had broken the treaty. It didn't matter that they had been provoked for half a century. It didn't matter that they'd tried every diplomatic channel. They had taken up arms without permission, and that was all the justification Rome needed. The stage was set for the final act of a rivalry that had spanned more than a century. The Third Punic War was about to begin, and its purpose wasn't subjugation, it was annihilation. In 149 BCE, the hammer fell. A massive Roman army landed at the nearby city of Utica, which had quickly defected to the Roman side. Commanded by two consuls, this wasn't an army for negotiation, it was an army of occupation. Even then, facing an overwhelming force at their doorstep, the Carthaginians clung to the desperate hope of appeasing Rome. They had already condemned their own general to death for the unsanctioned attack on Numidia, a pathetic attempt to show they were sorry. They sent an embassy to Utica, ready to submit to Rome's will, declaring their unconditional surrender. The Roman consuls started with a series of demands, each one designed to strip Carthage of its ability to resist. First, they demanded 300 hostages, the children of Carthage's most prominent families. With heavy hearts, the Carthaginians complied. Next, the Romans declared that since Carthage was now under their protection, it had no more need for weapons. They demanded that every last piece of military equipment be handed over. It was a staggering blow. Convoys began to trundle from Carthage to the Roman camp, loaded with the instruments of their own defense. Surviving records paint a grim picture of this disarmament. 200,000 sets of armor, countless javelins, and 2,000 catapults. Their few remaining warships were sailed to Utica and ceremoniously burned. Carthage was now, for all intents and purposes, defenseless. The city that once challenged Rome for mastery of the Mediterranean stood naked before its conqueror. Its children were hostages. Its armories were empty. The Carthaginian envoys must have believed that no further sacrifice could possibly be asked of them. It was at this moment of total vulnerability that the Romans revealed their true intention. Consul Lucius Marcius Censorinus, addressing the stunned delegation, delivered the death sentence. He praised them for their obedience, then delivered the blow. The Roman Senate had decreed that the city of Carthage itself must be abandoned. The entire population was to relocate at least 10 miles inland. Their beloved city, their home for centuries, would then be destroyed. The shock of this demand can't be overstated. This wasn't a strategic relocation. It was cultural and economic murder. Carthage was a sea power. Its identity, its wealth, its very existence was tied to the sea. To move inland was to become a nation of farmers, stripped of everything they were. It was a demand designed to be refused, an ultimatum crafted to force a war on Rome's terms, against an enemy they had just disarmed. The envoys who brought this news back to the city were nearly torn to pieces by the enraged populace. The mood of despair instantly curdled into pure fury. There was no more talk of negotiation. There was no more hope of mercy. They had been tricked, humiliated, and sentenced to oblivion. Faced with a choice between a quiet death in exile and a final stand in their ancestral home, the people of Carthage chose defiance. The gates of the city were slammed shut. Carthage, a city with no army and no weapons, had just declared war on the most powerful military machine in the known world. The moment the gates of Carthage slammed shut, a change swept through the city. The shock and rage gave way to a cold, unified resolve. Every citizen understood the reality of their situation. Rome was there to annihilate them. Survival was no longer a matter of diplomacy, but of iron and will. The entire city made a silent, sacred pact. They would forge a new army and a new arsenal from the very fabric of their city. Carthage, the bustling hub of commerce, would become a fortress. More than that, it would become one massive, secret weapons factory, hidden in plain sight. The task before them seemed impossible. They had just handed over an arsenal that took generations to build. Now, they had to replicate it in months, all while an enemy army was camped just outside their walls. What followed was one of the most incredible feats of mass mobilization in the ancient world. Public squares were transformed into open-air workshops. The great temples echoed with the clang of hammers. Buildings were torn down for their timber. The city was literally deconstructing itself to arm itself. Wealthy citizens melted down their gold and silver heirlooms to be recast as parts for swords and shields. Iron gates were ripped from their hinges. The entire population was conscripted into this desperate effort. There were no longer distinctions of class or profession. There were only defenders of Carthage. Men worked day and night, their faces lit by the glow of the forges. Women, in an act of supreme devotion, cut off their long hair to be braided into tough ropes for the catapults. The loss of 2,000 catapults had been devastating, but the women of Carthage would provide the means to build new ones, their own hair becoming the literal fiber of the city's resistance. The command structure was quickly re-established. The same general, Hasdrubal, who had been condemned to death to appease the Romans, was recalled and placed in charge of a new field army of around 30,000 men. This force would operate in the countryside, harassing Roman supply lines. The logistical organization required was staggering. Production quotas were established, turning this desperate improvisation into an efficient operation. According to the historian Appian, the city began churning out weapons at an astonishing rate. One source claims daily production hit 140 shields, 300 swords, and 500 spears. Whether these numbers are perfectly accurate is debatable, but they speak to the sheer intensity of the effort. The city was not just rearming, it was engaged in total war. This was more than military preparation, it was a ritual of defiance. Every sword hammered into shape was a rejection of Roman authority. The Romans, in their arrogance, believed they had disarmed a city. They had no idea they had armed its soul. They saw walls of stone, but behind them, a city of hundreds of thousands had become a single, unified weapon. The transformation of Carthage into a city-sized arsenal was a masterpiece of desperate logistics. The production quotas, hundreds of swords, spears, and shields each day, were the bare minimum required for survival. The challenge was immense, especially in sourcing raw materials for a city now completely cut off from its trade routes. The first source was the city itself. Teams of citizens scoured every building for usable metal. Decorative bronze fixtures, iron gratings, lead pipes, anything and everything was sent to the forges. The wealthy elite publicly donated their treasures to be melted down, a powerful symbolic act showing that the state now came before all private wealth. Timber was just as critical, needed for spear shafts, shield frames, and new siege engines. With the countryside a Roman patrolled hostile zone, they turned inward. Non-essential buildings were dismantled for their roof beams and support columns. Old ships rotting in the inner harbor were broken apart, their seasoned timber proving invaluable. The masters of this enterprise were Carthage's own artisans. Though their grand armories were empty, the knowledge remained. Blacksmiths who once forged anchors now taught apprentices in frantic, round-the-clock sessions. Carpenters who built merchant vessels now applied their skills to the complex mechanics of catapults. The most iconic example of this ingenuity was the creation of catapult ropes. Torsion catapults, the heavy artillery of the day, relied on tightly wound skeins of rope, usually made from animal sinew. With those materials cut off, the city faced a critical shortage. The solution was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The women of Carthage sheared their long hair. These locks were then painstakingly woven into thick, powerful cords, literally binding their own bodies to the defense of their city. This period of frantic preparation culminated in one of the most audacious gambits of the war. According to the histories, the Carthaginians began a secret project. Hidden from Roman view, they started building a new fleet of 50 warships. For 2 years, as the Romans focused on the landward walls, this naval project apparently went undetected. It was an astonishing feat of engineering and operational security. While the Romans outside saw a city they had trapped, the reality was starkly different. They were laying siege to a hornet's nest. Behind those walls, a new army was being equipped, new artillery was being assembled, and a new navy was being built. Carthage was not passively awaiting its fate. It was preparing to meet Roman arrogance with a storm of its own making. In the summer of 149 BCE, the Roman consuls prepared for the final assault. Their mood was one of supreme confidence. They figured they were about to attack a completely unarmed city. The campaign, they assumed, would be over in a flash. They planned a two-pronged attack. One force would hit the main landward walls, while the other would attack a supposedly weaker section by the sea. The Romans brought up their siege ladders and 2 enormous battering rams. The legionaries advanced, expecting to meet little more than rocks and desperation. What they got was a hurricane of steel. As the Roman soldiers approached, they were met with a furious barrage of missiles. The walls, which they assumed were stripped of artillery, bristled with newly made catapults. A hail of heavy stones and iron-tipped bolts crashed down on them, shattering shields and bodies. Archers and slingers added to the deadly storm. The Romans, stunned by this ferocious and unexpected resistance, faltered. Despite the heavy fire, the legionaries pressed on. They brought the massive battering rams into position and began hammering the walls. A section crumbled, and a breach was made. With a roar, the Romans stormed forward, scrambling over the rubble. But the Carthaginians were waiting. As the Romans scrambled through the narrow breach, they lost all formation. They were met by a solid wall of defenders armed with newly forged swords and shields, who threw them back with savage force. The assault turned into a bloody, chaotic melee in the bottleneck of the breach. The Romans, who had expected an easy victory, were routed and forced to retreat in disarray. It was during this chaotic retreat that a young military tribune first distinguished himself. His name was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the great Scipio Africanus. While other officers panicked, Scipio had held his men back. As the repulsed Roman attackers fled, pursued by the triumphant Carthaginians, Scipio's disciplined troops acted as a rearguard, saving the rest of the force from complete disaster. It was a sign of the tactical calm that would later define his command. The simultaneous naval assault fared no better. The defenders even sent out commandos at night to swim out and set fire to Roman siege engines. The initial Roman attacks had been a complete and humiliating failure. Their arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the grim realization that this would not be a short war. Carthage was not a defenseless victim. It was a fortress defended by a people with nothing left to lose. The failure of the first Roman assaults marked a turning point. The dream of a quick victory was dead, replaced by the grueling reality of a protracted siege. For the next 2 years, the war devolved into a brutal stalemate. The Roman campaign suffered repeated setbacks. The commanders who followed in 148 BCE proved inept, and morale sagged as disease festered in their camps. The Carthaginian defenders, emboldened by their success, launched frequent sorties from the city gates to attack Roman siege works. Outside the city, Hasdrubal's field army was a persistent menace. The cavalry commander Hamilco, in particular, became a terror to the Romans, leading lightning-fast raids on foraging parties that severely disrupted their supply chain. In a display of escalating brutality, Hasdrubal, the commander inside the city, decided to send a terrifying message. He had Roman prisoners taken to the top of the walls, where they were brutally tortured to death in full view of the Roman army. This horrific act was meant to extinguish any thought of surrender among his own people and to enrage the Romans beyond any hope of reconciliation. From this point on, the war would be fought to the absolute death. Yet, even in this struggle, the Carthaginians prepared their most audacious stroke. For 2 years, they had been working on their secret fleet. In late 147 BCE, the Romans were stunned to see 50 new Carthaginian warships emerge into the open sea. They had sortied from a new channel, which had been excavated in complete secrecy. The surprise was total. For a moment, the strategic situation was transformed. The Romans scrambled to meet this unexpected threat. However, the Carthaginians were undone by misfortune. Their new crews lacked the coordination of their veteran Roman counterparts. After an indecisive battle, the Carthaginian commander ordered a withdrawal. The retreat was mismanaged. The smaller vessels blocked the path for the larger warships, creating a bottleneck at the entrance. The Roman fleet seized the opportunity and fell upon the disorganized Carthaginian ships, destroying many of them. What should have been a triumphant surprise attack ended in a costly naval defeat. It was a heartbreaking end to a brilliant plan. As 147 BCE dawned, Rome was growing impatient. 2 years of failed assaults and incompetent commanders had turned the siege into a political embarrassment. The public was demanding results, and their frustration found a focus in one man, Scipio Aemilianus. Scipio, who had distinguished himself from the very beginning, had become a symbol of competence in a campaign defined by failure. He had continued to serve with distinction, even persuading the skilled Carthaginian cavalry commander Hamilco to defect to the Roman side, a major military coup. Though technically too young to be elected consul, the highest office in the Republic, public support for Scipio was so overwhelming that the Senate set aside the usual rules. He was appointed consul and given sole command of the war. The arrival of Scipio Aemilianus marked the beginning of the end for Carthage. He wasn't just another consul. He was the adopted grandson of the man who defeated Hannibal. But more than his famous name, Scipio brought what Rome had sorely lacked: discipline, strategic vision, and a relentless, methodical approach to war. Upon arriving in Africa, Scipio was appalled. The Roman army was lazy and undisciplined. The camps looked more like a bustling market than a military encampment. Scipio's first act wasn't to attack Carthage, but to purge his own army. He immediately expelled all non-essential personnel, enforced strict discipline, and put the soldiers through constant, grueling drills. With his army in order, Scipio turned to strategy. He recognized that the previous frontal assaults had been costly and foolish. His strategy would be one of strangulation. He would rely on brilliant engineering and relentless pressure, not risky assaults, to bring the city to its knees. Carthage would be isolated, starved, and slowly choked into submission. The era of successful Carthaginian defiance was over. The noose was about to be tightened. With his army disciplined, Scipio Aemilianus began the systematic isolation of Carthage. His plan was a marvel of military engineering. designed to cut the city off from all hope of aid. His first target was the sea. Small, swift blockade runners still managed to occasionally slip past the Roman fleet. To stop this, Scipio ordered the construction of a massive mole, a huge stone and earth causeway, to be built directly across the mouth of the harbor. Legionaries worked day and night, dumping thousands of tons of rock into the sea, physically sealing the harbor entrance and severing the city's main artery to the outside world. Next, Scipio turned to the land. The isthmus connecting Carthage to the mainland was its only other lifeline. To seal this route, Scipio ordered the construction of a massive wall of circumvallation, a line of fortifications that would stretch across the entire isthmus, complete with trenches and towers. This siege wall effectively imprisoned Carthage. To bring maximum firepower to bear, he then began constructing a huge brick structure on the quay inside the harbor area, which the Romans now controlled. This wall was built to be as high as Carthage's own, allowing Roman archers and catapults to shoot directly down onto the defenders from close range. The final piece of Scipio's plan was to eliminate Hasdrubal's field army. He dispatched forces to lay siege to the key Carthaginian stronghold of Nepharis. After a siege of 22 days, the stronghold fell, and the Carthaginian field army was annihilated. The defenders inside Carthage watched their last hope of rescue disappear. Scipio's noose was now complete. The mole blocked the sea. The siege wall blocked the land. The external army was destroyed. Carthage was utterly alone, a prison city facing the terrifying prospect of starvation. The war had entered its final, grimmest phase. By the spring of 146 BCE, Carthage was on the brink of collapse. Starvation and disease were rampant. Scipio, having methodically starved his enemy, now judged them weak enough for the final blow. The assault began with a quiet infiltration near the harbor district. Scipio's men scaled the walls under the cover of night, secured a gate, and soon Roman soldiers were pouring into the city. What followed was not a swift capture, but a week-long descent into hell. The Romans found themselves drawn into one of the most brutal urban battles in ancient history. The fighting would last for 6 excruciating days and nights, without pause. Carthage was a dense labyrinth of narrow, winding streets and multi-story houses. Every street corner became a barricade, every house a fortress. The starving citizens, men and women alike, fought with the savage ferocity of cornered animals from doorways, alleys, and rooftops. As Roman legionaries advanced down a street, they were pelted from above with roof tiles and stones. The battle became three-dimensional, moving from street to street, house to house, and rooftop to rooftop. To break the deadlock, Scipio gave a terrible order: set fire to the houses. A great fire began to consume the city, its smoke choking the sky. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the roar of the flames. The battle became a nightmarish crawl through a burning, blood-soaked maze. Scipio organized his troops into relays, ensuring a constant supply of fresh soldiers pushing forward, while the exhausted defenders had no such relief. He ordered his men to clear the streets of rubble and bodies, both living and dead, to speed up the advance. Thousands of civilians, trapped in their homes, were burned alive. For 6 days, this horror continued. The Romans clawed their way forward through fire and slaughter, pushing ever closer to the city's heart, the Byrsa, the fortified citadel on a high hill. This was the last bastion of resistance, now crowded with tens of thousands of terrified civilians. The final, tragic act was about to begin. After 6 days of brutal street fighting, the Roman legions finally reached the foot of the Byrsa. This ancient citadel was now the city's last refuge, its slopes crowded with an estimated 50,000 starving, terrified survivors. Seeing the utter hopelessness of their situation, a delegation emerged from the Biersa and begged Scipio for their lives. Scipio agreed to spare them. A great, wretched column of 50,000 men, women, and children filed out of the citadel to be sold into slavery. They were the last citizens of a once great empire. However, a group of 900 Roman deserters who had fought for Carthage knew that for them, surrender meant certain torture and execution. They, along with the commander Hasdrubal and his family, barricaded themselves inside the magnificent temple of Eschmoun at the peak of the citadel. Here, the final drama unfolded. As the Romans prepared to storm the temple, Hasdrubal, the man who had ordered Roman prisoners tortured on the walls, lost his nerve. He secretly abandoned his men and his family and crept out to surrender to Scipio, begging for his life. What happened next was witnessed by the Roman army. Hasdrubal's wife, standing on the ramparts of the burning temple, saw her husband groveling at Scipio's feet. Filled with contempt, she appeared in her finest clothes, cursed him as a traitor, and then, in a final act of defiance, threw her children into the flames before leaping in herself. The 900 deserters, seeing all hope was lost, set fire to the temple around them, choosing to die in the inferno rather than face Roman justice. The flames of the Temple of Eschmoun served as the funeral pyre for the city of Carthage. After the final resistance was extinguished, the Roman Senate sent a commission to oversee the final destruction. The orders were absolute. The remaining buildings were torn down, the rubble scattered. For 17 days, the fires burned as the city was systematically erased from the face of the earth. The story that the Romans sowed the fields with salt is a potent image, but it's a later myth. The reality was brutal enough. Carthage was left abandoned and in ruins, a cursed and desolate place. A great civilization had been extinguished. The destruction of Carthage was more than the end of a war. It was the end of an era. It was a final, brutal statement of Roman dominance over the Mediterranean. Rome now stood unopposed. The historian Polybius, who was there at the fall, watched the city burn and saw Scipio Aemilianus weeping. When asked why he wept for his enemy, Scipio reportedly spoke of the fate of all great empires, fearing that one day Rome itself might suffer a similar destiny. It was a moment of profound reflection amidst the carnage. The legacy of Carthage's final stand is complex. It was a futile struggle against an inevitable outcome, but on the other hand, it stands as one of history's most powerful testaments to the human will. Faced with an unthinkable ultimatum, the people of Carthage did not surrender their spirit. They chose to fight. They turned their entire city into an arsenal, their homes into forges, and held the most powerful army in the world at bay through sheer ingenuity and courage. The story of how Carthage secretly forged an arsenal to defy Rome is not just about military tactics. It's a story about a people's refusal to be erased, their determination to meet their end not on their knees, but on their feet, fighting for their home. They lost, their city was destroyed, and their people enslaved, but in their defiance, they left behind a legend that has outlasted the ruins of their city. What does this story tell us about the power of collective will against impossible odds? Was Carthage's final act a pointless sacrifice or its finest hour? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more stories from the ancient world brought to life, make sure to subscribe and support the channel. Thank you for watching.